Hey guys, this is Jason, and I'm going to cover what is Sass conceptually. Because once you actually understand what it is, that's the biggest hurdle to people using it. Is more of like, well, how do I use it? I've heard the benefits; they sound really great, and but we're all very busy as developers, and we're trying to get projects done, and a lot of times you just go, I just want to write some CSS, get the project done, and move on to the next one. But how many times have you been pulling your hair out trying to solve a particular front end problem, specifically related to CSS? And a lot of times that's what this tool is designed to address. It helps with organization and reduces oddities that you have to go and try and fix. And so, as a developer, the reason why you want to use it is because a lot of times you need to make a change to a project, and you don't want to have to go, I don't understand why this particular front end quirk or issue, browser issue, why is the styling not being applied? To go through those troubleshooting steps and diagnostics to try and identify the solution to the problem. Sass helps minify those problems so you don't have to spend as much time solving them. That is the main reason why I personally like Sass. Sass is about organization and reducing those problems. It is not necessarily directly to help with speed or to somehow make you faster. But that's why you'd want to use Sass, is it helps you with those things. The barrier to entry to Sass is extremely small, and from what I can tell, the reason why most people don't use it is because it takes time to, especially on your own, to learn how to use it. But if somebody could just sit down and tell you what the thing is and tell you how to use it, even at just the basic level, then exploring all the other things it can do doesn't really take any time. So for instance, if I knew how to create a variable, then if I needed to create a variable that was a string, well, if I already knew how to create a variable and I already knew how to create an integer that's a variable, learning how to create a string is easy. Same thing with Sass. Once you learn what it is and how to use it, it becomes extremely easy to just kind of pick up and run with it with a very small learning curve. So that's kind of what Sass is. Now, if you don't know what CSS is, this video is not for you. You need to go study up on CSS and understand what that is before Sass is. Sass is very much tied to CSS, and so there you go. But I'm going to assume you know what CSS is, and you want to get a working knowledge of Sass, and this video will do it. All right. So first of all, let's talk about what Sass is. Sass, you can think of it as a text file. So if I created a text file called style.scss, which contained, and I'll just put a little underline here so you can see it, which contains something like this: CSS code. You all recognize this. It's just CSS. This is valid Sass. Sass is a superset of CSS. So is less. And everything I'm talking about, for the most part, will apply to less as well. So if you were to take this style.scss file, which contains this h1 font size 20 pixels, and run it through a program like CodeKit, where you just say, hey CodeKit, take this SCSS text file, which contains h1 font size 20, and compile it using the Sass compiler, you would end up with a style.css file which contains the exact same thing. Congratulations, that is how complex Sass is. It is a text file which gets run through a program to then output CSS as a CSS file. That is all that it is. Now, you can also do things like this. Let's say I created a variable, and in Sass, the way that you create a variable is with a $sign. You name it, colon, and then you give it a value. That's it. Now I can come down here and do that. Or I could do this. And you can see the power of how variables alone work. I can now change this color right here, and it will change in every place that that variable is used. That one feature alone is worth using Sass, considering all you have to do is run it through a compiler, where you just say, hey, CodeKit, add this file, hit process down in the corner, and it creates your CSS files, which those files are what are linked to from your HTML. But variables are a very, very small part of how useful Sass is. It can do many, many things. Imagine writing one line to create a gradient that's already vendor prefixed. Imagine creating separate pings and saving them in an images directory, and then writing one line to use those pings as a background image, which then becomes a sprite sheet automatically for you. It creates the sprite sheet for you, writes all the code for you, creates the image itself for you, the sprite sheet file. Sass and Compass can do things like that. Imagine defining styles. I could come in here and say, and define as many styles as I wanted to right here, and then I could come down here and reuse those. It's infinitely kind of complex. You could create, it's kind of like a basic programming language. But remember, it's a superset, and nothing's very complex. In fact, one of the reasons why I personally like it is simply for its nesting. Imagine if I had a paragraph, and then inside of the paragraph, I have an anchor with more styles. And remember, these can be this can be an ID, a class, or whatever, but the nesting is defined specificity. And so if I come down here and style an anchor, then anything that I put right here will override anything that I put right here. And so if I had a font size here and a color, and then I had a color right here, this color would override the color that was right here, only when it's inside of a paragraph tag or whatever element you have. And so keeping the nesting is really organized. The specificity alone that it provides means that you're going to have so many less issues with styles overriding each other. Imagine if I want, only on this element right here, on only this element, that on phones, I want it to be different. You can come in here, and with one line of code, you could do something like this. And then write some styles. And now this anchor will be styled based on whatever you type here, only on phones, and only when it's in the structure. And it's infinitely nestable, and handles all the specificity for you. And so that's why I started using it. It's amazing. I could never go back. I mean, could you imagine writing different media queries all over the place and trying to hunt down stuff and keep things organized? It would not be pleasant. So that's some of the things that Sass and Compass can do for you. Now, we talked about the fact that Sass is just a text file which gets run through a compiler. So what is this Compass thing? Well, you can think of Compass as a different compiler. So CodeKit can use the Sass compiler to compile these things, or it can use the Compass compiler to compile these things. So for instance, let's say that I included a gradient mixin. And this would actually say include. But let's say that I included a gradient mixin here. Well, the Sass compiler may not know what this particular mixin, and you think of it as a function, is, but the Compass compiler will. And so anything that you write that Sass can understand, the Compass compiler can understand too. So just use Compass. Just write Compass code. And you're not even really using Compass code. You're just doing things that Compass can do, and then use Compass to compile the CSS file. And that's what Compass is. It's just a different compiler. I'm not going to go into under the hood what Compass is. If you care, you can read more on the Grunt video that I have to talk about kind of how that stuff works. But that is all Sass and Compass is. And so let's say that in your style.scss file that I wanted to include a different file. Let's say that I have another file called about.scss, which has some rules applied to it, like this. And so you see these. So you have two files. And I'll just, for the sake of clarity, do this. So I have two files, style.scss and about.scss. Well, you say, so it compiles these two CSS files. Does that mean that it's going to end up with a style.css and an about.css? Well, yes. If you add these two files as is, you would end up with a style.css and an about.css. But let's say you go, I don't want that. I want a single CSS file which contains all of the other CSS files. Well, then what you can do is in this file, you can say at include, and then in parentheses, you can say about. And now what will happen is you would end up with an about.css file and a style.css file, which also contains the about.css compiled code, the resulted code. But you go, that still is two files. So to fix that, you add an underscore. Now, when you compile style.scss, it will bring in about CSS. See that this file, which you do not need a underscore right here, see that this file has an underscore, which is a convention to say that it does not compile directly. And then you will end up with one file, style.css, which includes everything from all your other files. So you could have many files in here. And there you go. And it'll create one file called style.css, which then gets linked to from your HTML. That's it. Now, a lot of people will go, so you're creating a CSS file which contains other files. Well, then how do I debug that? If I'm in Chrome DevTools and I right-click on an element and I inspect it and I see the CSS code from that, that CSS code is not where it really is written. Well, what you can do is the Compass compiler can be set to include debug info. And Chrome DevTools can be set to read that debug info that's embedded inside of the compiled CSS file to show you the original location, so that when you do right-click on an element and want to see what code it is, it'll actually say that this thing is the H1 that's styled in contact.scss, and it'll give you the correct line number. And so you're able to debug that way. It's extremely powerful with the things you can do. But understand that with all of this stuff, you're still able to read it. There's nothing inside of Compass or Sass that is, if you're unfamiliar with it and just know CSS, that you wouldn't understand. I mean, if you saw this add include about contact, all right, you kind of had an indication that those are including those things. If you saw nested code like I had before, it's not unreadable. Like if you saw this, you're like, well, it's pretty clear that they're saying it's got a gradient on it. I mean, this anchor's got a gradient on it. This is saying that, oh, on phones, it is whatever code is in here. And so it's easy to follow and understand. And you don't have to write it. Like if you come in here and you're working with another developer who does know Sass and you don't have to use Sass code. You can say, you know what, I'm just going to ignore all this and I'm just going to write some CSS right here. It'll work just fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. So that is all that Sass is. It's not any more complex than that. People kind of get, I think, hung up on the compilation side. So I'm writing Sass, but how does that actually end up where I use it? Well, it just is a text file that's converted into another text file, and that resulted text file, the one that gets created from your Sass file, is what you actually link to and use. That's all there is. And then with Compass, think of it as just another compiler. CodeKit is able to compile, whether it's Compass or Sass, and you tell it in CodeKit. So what you do is actually say, hey, these files that I just brought in, use Compass to compile that, and the result is the same. And so, I mean, there's specifics that you'll need to understand, and there's little nuances kind of throughout, but conceptually, this is all it is. So for instance, if you came down and I tried to do this, where I actually included the gradient, and I just tried to compile this file, Compass may say, I don't know what the gradient is. Well, in the documentation for where you see gradient, it will say you must include the CSS3 Compass mixins for that. So just like I showed you how to include other files, you can also include Compass files that the Compass compiler recognizes. So these aren't files on your hard drive. These are files that exist within inside of the Compass compiler itself. So if I come up here and type include, and this is pseudocode, but basically I would say CSS3. Then when I run this, then when the compiler comes across this, I'm going to include CSS3. Okay, Compass goes, includes all the CSS3 code that it needs so that it does understand what gradient is. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming, this is very akin to, including a class so that you can use it, or requiring a class. Then that's it. So there's little nuances like that, but all of these things are in the documentation, and the errors that you will get as you code are very clear with saying what's wrong. But it doesn't really get much more complex than this. Yes, there are massive amounts of mixins that you can use, drop shadows and gradients and glows, tools for animation, basically anything that's involved with CSS. So you'll never type a reset or a vendor prefix again. So it handles all of that. You don't have to use them, but they're there. And the amount of things that they have are extremely vast, and nobody knows them all. I don't even know them all. And so it's one of those things where you go, oh, look, I'm typing more than one line to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. That probably means that Sass has a solution to that. Or, hey, what I'm about to type doesn't work in all browsers. Sass probably has a solution to that, or Compass. So, that's all there is to this. If you're curious, CodeKit makes the barrier of entry very small to start using Sass and Compass. But the way that I do it is I use Grunt on the command line, but the result is the same. And so whether you use CodeKit or a Grunt task, it's the same thing. Grunt is significantly more powerful and customizable and can do a lot more without even outside of Compass. And you can watch my video on Grunt if you want to see that. But that's all that Compass is. So if you're doing CSS as a web developer and you are not using a precompiler, there's really no reason not to. It's got your debug info, it helps you with organization, it writes more optimized CSS, the list goes on and on and on. And it's faster, like if you want to come down to it, like you are indeed writing less code to get the job done, and it's cleaner and more organized. So that's it. I hope that this will kind of get you inspired. All you need to do is create a file with an SCSS extension, run that file through something like CodeKit, just add the file to the program, click a little plus, and then click process, and it will create a style or your file.css. And you can use that file just like a regular CSS file. That's all there is to it. So go try it. Good luck, and I will see you on the interwebs.